Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 30 of The Kill File. I am so glad to see you guys come back for the last installment of the Yorkshire Ripper. Just a few quick reminders. Don't forget that you can suggest a case to me on the website thekillfile.com, and also let me know if you want me to shout out your name for the suggestion. Just a heads up, I do tend to shy away from the really well-known cases as I feel they're oversaturated, but I may consider doing them for bonus content. If you have any smaller cases that you know of or that are local, give me a shout. Okay, so last week we left off when Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper, killed what was said to be the first woman in the series of the last 6 murders that are known. We are just going to jump right into the next victim. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, body mutilation, brutality, and descriptions of crime scenes. Barbara Leach was said to be a 20-year-old college student that was just about to start her 3rd year, and this would be her final year to obtain her degree in psychology when, unfortunately, she would run into Peter. In the wee hours of September 2nd in 1979, Barbara was out with some friends at the Manville Arms, and this was said to be located on Great Horton Street. This pub was said to usually close around 11 p.m., and Barbara and her friends on this particular evening were gracious enough to help the landlord clean up by grabbing empty bottles and cleaning up after the guests left. As their reward, Roy Evans gave each of them a drink after hours for helping him. When the group left the pub, and this would be around 12:45 a.m., Barbara set out to walk home, even though there was a drizzle of rain in the area. The rest of her friends must have either called taxis or gotten rides, because no one else wanted to join Barbara for a night walk. Unfortunately, at the same time, Peter was driving through the area and he spotted Barbara on her walk home alone. He then passed her in his car and quickly turned left onto a street called Ash Grove. He then got out of the car as Barbara was walking towards him. He allowed her to walk past him before he brought out his hammer and then he attacked her from behind. Peter then grabbed her body and dragged her into the backyard of a house that was nearby. Then Peter was said to have grabbed her shirt and pulled it up, exposing her breasts. And then it was said that he would undo her pants, and of course he pulled him down. He then began to stab her with the screwdriver that he had used on earlier victims that was said to have been sharpened. This is the same screwdriver that Peter had used on Josephine Whitaker. At this time, Peter would take the body of Barbara and put her in what was described as a quote-unquote distorted jackknife position behind a wall that was low, and this was in the area of where the trash cans are usually kept. Peter then covered her up with a piece of old carpet and then placed some stones on top of the carpet. Barbara's roommate was said to be concerned that she had not returned on the evening late Sunday, and then she called the police. The next day around 4 p.m., while the authorities were looking for the missing girl, a police constable, Simon Graves, found Barbara's body under the carpet where Peter had left her. They saw the wounds were similar to the ones on poor Josephine Whitaker, and this, of course, would let the authorities know that the Yorkshire Ripper had struck again in the area. Peter was quoted saying about this murder, quote, "I took hold of her by the wrists, or was it the ankles, and dragged her up to the entrance to the back of the house. She kept making loud moaning noises. There was like a dustbin area at the rear of the house. I remember that I stabbed Barbara with the screwdriver, the same one as Whitaker, and I remember that I put her in the dustbin area and covered her up with something. But I was acting like an automaton, and I can't seem to remember the sequence of actions." End quote. It almost seems at this point as if some of the murders that this monster was committing are starting to run together. It actually kind of surprises me that he's able to name the women, to be honest. I was shocked when I first started reading that he could recount every single one. The Yorkshire Ripper's next victim is going to be a woman by the name of Marguerite Walls, who was said to be 40 years old and was actually a civil servant who worked at the Department of Education and Science office that was located in Pudsley. On August 20th, 1980, she had been taking some extra hours because after this she was going to be on a 10-day vacation. Marguerite was leaving her office around 9:30 to 10:30 p.m., and she headed out for the half-a-mile walk that was the distance to her home, and she was said to be living in Farsley at the time, which apparently is a suburb of Leeds. Unfortunately, Peter was also out this same night and just happened to be driving through the Farsley area on his way home from Chapeltown, and this is when he would see Marguerite walking towards his car. Peter then decided to park his car, and then quickly he was able to catch up to the poor woman, and then he was able to overtake her. He was able to get her about 400 yards, and this would be near a driveway that apparently had high pillars that were made of stone. Peter actually stunned her with the first hammer blow that would hit her on the back of the head. He would shout, quote, "filthy prostitute," when he continued to hit her in the head. He then took a piece of rope and put it around her neck and continued to tighten it as he drug/carried her for around 20 yards from where he had first attacked her. He then drug her all the way up the driveway and the garden that had high walls. He kneeled on her chest and then he strangled her. After he knew that Marguerite was dead, he took off all of her clothing with the exception of her tights. When Peter left the body, he had covered her up with grass clippings and leaves. I found this one interesting as he strangled her. I couldn't help but wonder why he would change the mode of murder unless it was just the pure fact that he didn't want to get caught. The next day, 2 gardeners would find her and also spot her shoes in the driveway, as well as her skirt, her checkbook, and a shopping bag. The man at the time who had been the detective chief superintendent named James Hobson was working closely with forensic experts for this case as he announced that they did not believe that this was a Yorkshire Ripper killing. They did, however, agree that there were quote-unquote Ripper-like elements clear in the attack of the poor woman. They felt that the use of a ligature and the obvious lack of stab wounds would actually suggest to them that there could be a new killer on the loose. There had never been ligatures in the Ripper killings before. This was done by Peter in an effort to mislead the police, hopefully having them hunt for another killer rather than himself. The authorities announcing to the media that they believed this to be the killing of local means kept the media about the Ripper lower due to not having ties with the usual style killings. People may have begun to feel like the Yorkshire Ripper was going through a dormant period, having no idea that this was just Peter trying to be clever. Unfortunately, it worked. I'm always curious why more serial killers don't do this. Not that I want them to be super clever, but for killers who choose random acts of violence and don't always use the same method of killing, it seems that they are harder to catch because their attacks aren't usually linked together for a while, unless they leave like the same shoe print or some evidence behind. During his confessions, Peter at first did not take responsibility for the murder of Marguerite, saying that he was afraid with his method of strangulation that would open him up to being suspicious for murders that he didn't actually commit, and he figured it would be easier just to clear it up later. Douche. He said something to the tune of, since he lied about it at first and then decided to be honest, he didn't think that anyone would take anything that he said very seriously, which is why he had decided to give such a detailed account of his killings. About using the rope to strangle Marguerite, Peter said, quote, "Because the press and media had attached a stigma to me, I had been known for some time as the Yorkshire Ripper, which, to my mind, didn't ring true at all. It was just my way of killing them, but I actually found that the method of strangulation was even more horrible and took longer. This is when I decided I couldn't kill people like this. I couldn't bear to go through with it again, and there was something deep inside preventing me." End quote. What in the actual fuck? He decided that he couldn't bear to go through the process of strangulation, but apparently has no problem brutally slashing women all over their bodies in a bloody mess? That's fucking weird. The next victim that was attacked by the Yorkshire Ripper was a 34-year-old woman named Upadhyaya Bandera, who was said to be at the time a doctor from Singapore. Upadhyaya was in the area taking a course at a place called Nuffield Center. On the evening of September 2nd, 1980, Upadhyaya was walking home after having visited some friends. She had been walking on the road that was near the Arundel Center named Otley Road, and after she was passing a local KFC, she took notice of a man that had been sitting inside of the restaurant staring at her. As she continued her walk, she ended up having to turn down a road made of cobblestone that wasn't lit very well, and this was called Chapel Lane. It happened to be the alleyway or a sort of shortcut through the road called Cardigan. Around 10:30 this evening, while Upadhyaya was walking through that alleyway, she had moved out of the way for someone who she thought wanted to pass her, but instead she was slammed in the back of the head twice, and this knocked her unconscious. As she was passed out, there was said to be a loop of rope placed around her neck, and Peter had begun to drag her down the alleyway, and this is when he would realize that her shoes were making a horrific scratching noise. He laid her on the ground and decided to take her shoes off, and also took her purse and threw both of these items over a wall. When the owner of the house who backed to this alleyway and spot had heard a strange noise, she came to figure out what was going on at her back door, so she ended up calling the police. When Peter was disturbed by this, he fled the scene. This is when Upadhyaya regained consciousness, and when she woke up, she saw a policeman standing over her, having arrived only moments after the Yorkshire Ripper had fled. Upadhyaya, or rather Dr. Bandera, was able to actually see her attacker before she had passed out. She would go on to describe Peter as being around 5'4", and she thought him to be about 25 years old. She said the man had black hair and with a full beard and mustache. Again, due to the lack of stabbing and because the attacker used a ligature, Dr. Banderas' attack was not linked to the Yorkshire Ripper. They were able to link her attack, though, to Marguerite Walls, and again the authorities thought that they were dealing with a new killer on their hands. About this attack, Peter would say, quote, "Yes, I used the rope on that girl. She was walking slowly along like a prostitute, and I hit her on the head with a hammer. I had looped a rope around her neck. I didn't have any tools with me to finish her off, so I used the rope. I dragged her down the road, and her shoes were making a scraping noise. I apologized to her and took her shoes off and put them over a wall with her handbag." End quote. At one point, Peter had made a statement trying to say that while he was trying to use the rope and strangle her, that he was so overcome with remorse that he didn't kill her, but rather apologized and ran, leaving her there. Funny, though, that at the exact same time his alleged conscience was telling him something, that this was the same time that the lady who knew something was going on in the alley had called the cops. I don't think he was sorry at all. He is too far gone, in my opinion, to feel any sort of remorse. I'm just glad that this poor woman lived. On November 5th, 1980, in Huddersfield, a young lady who was only the age of 16, named Teresa Sykes, was attacked by Peter while walking home from a grocery store buying cigarettes. She had been walking on a path that was said to be next to the grassland and was actually almost home when the sick fuck, Peter Sutcliffe, came out from behind the shadows and caught up with her and hit her in the back of the head. Teresa fell, but turned while she did and tried to grab the weapon, which good for you, girl. She was later on able to tell the authorities that the weapon was metal. So yes, this victim lived. Yay. Her description that she was able to give the police about Peter was that he had black hair, a beard, and a mustache. Apparently, the second hit that Peter gave to Teresa had hit her high up on the forehead, and this left her with a quote-unquote half-moon scar on it. Teresa was able to scream so loudly that the neighbors actually heard them, as well as her boyfriend, who was also the father of their newborn baby boy, just 3 months old. When he heard her scream, he came running out of the house, and Peter fled the scene. But Jim Fure, Teresa's boyfriend, chased Peter, who was disappearing into the darkness. Peter had actually hidden behind a hedge that was on somebody's front yard, and he stayed there in a crouch position until Jim thought that he had lost the attacker and was forced to give up and head back. Only then did Peter come out of hiding and leave the area, and this would be the closest that Peter had ever come to being caught in his monstrous acts. At first, the authorities wouldn't think that this attack was done by the Ripper. However, later on, police would change their tune. It was stated that the time frame of this attack, which was 8 p.m., would be one of the things that actually aided to the downfall of the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, because just 8 weeks after this attack, when Peter Sutcliffe was finally arrested in Sheffield, his alibi for the attack, and unfortunately for him, his wife Sonia's remembrance of this evening, did not match. About this attack, Peter would say, quote, "I attacked her because she was the first person that I saw that night. At first, it didn't take me any time to decide which women were prostitutes. I think something clicked because she had on a straight skirt with a slit in it. She crossed the road in front of me." End quote. This makes me so fucking angry. So because this woman, who, by the way, had a brand new baby at home, just 3 months old, and a boyfriend, happened to be wearing a skirt with a slit in it, walking home, minding her own fucking business, you decided that she was a sex worker and wanted to kill her? So what if she was? This man makes my blood boil. Women should be able to wear whatever the fuck they want without being harassed. Period. All right, you guys, here it is. The final Yorkshire Ripper victim. I will let you know that I did see a few names that were for some reason not connected at first, but may still be victims as well. On November 17th, 1980, so just 12 days after his last attack, Peter Sutcliffe would see a woman who would be his final victim. Jacqueline Hill, who was only 20 years old, who was said to be a junior in college, and had been studying for an English degree, was headed back home to her college dorm hall in Headingley, Leeds, when the weather was not so great as it was wet and raining. It was said that she had been attending a seminar that was by a probation officer in the center of Leeds, and was able to catch a bus at 9 p.m. on Crookridge Street, where she would then exit at the main road of Leeds, Otley, and this was across the street from a shopping center called Arndale. She would turn onto a road called Alma, for the only 100-yard walk to her place of residence. Sadly, Peter was sitting in the car, and he was parked right outside of the Arndale shopping center as he was eating what was said to be a carton of KFC chips. If I'm not mistaken, across the pond, what they call chips, we call French fries. Only 7 weeks prior to this is when he was in the same area and had seen and attacked Dr. Bandera. As the Ripper caught a glimpse of Jacqueline, he started his car and he turned up the same road, passing her. He then stopped his vehicle and was waiting for her to pass him. As she passed him, he quickly got out of the car and started following her for only a short minute before he hit her in the head. Within just a few seconds of this, there was another woman walking down the same street by the name of Andre Proctor. Peter quickly stood Jacqueline up and drug her around 30 yards to some bare land that was behind the Arndale. He then proceeded to take off her clothing and stabbed her with a screwdriver that had a yellow handle over and over again in her chest and one time in the eye as well. Where Peter had first hit Jacqueline, a fellow student has seen Jacqueline's cream-colored bag, and this was around 10 p.m. This wasn't much longer after she had been attacked at first, which was around 9:30 p.m. The student saw that there appeared to be spots of blood, and having talked about it with other students, the group decided to call the police. Good for them. It was said that the police were able to do a less than thorough, quick search of the area by flashlight for only about 3 minutes, but of course they didn't find Jacqueline's mittens, glasses, or even her body. Her body would not be discovered until the next morning by a manager of one of the shops at the Arndale shopping center named Donald Court. He had been walking along the ramp that led to the parking lot when he happened to glance over the wall and was able to see poor Jacqueline's body. About this attack, Peter stated, quote, "I pulled Miss Hill's clothes off, most of them. I had a screwdriver on me. I think it had a yellow handle and a bent blade. I stabbed her in the lungs. Her eyes were wide open, and she seemed to be looking at me with an accusing stare. This shook me up a bit. I jammed the screwdriver into her eye, but they stayed open, and I felt worse than ever. I left her lying on her back with her feet towards the entrance. I think she was dead when I left." End quote. I don't believe for 1 second that this sick fuck was feeling sorry or feeling sad or bad about this at all. I'm going to venture a guess that he was in a rage when he attacked her, and the fact that her eyes were open made him mad, and that's why he probably stabbed her in the eye. If they stay open, then I'm guessing she was already dead when he did this. I hope for her sake that she was, so she could be spared that pain. One of the other things Peter was quoted stating about this attack was, quote, "Well, I'm terribly sorry about this tragic loss to her family and friends. I would do anything to alter what happened. I'm glad that I have been apprehended because I was totally out of my mind when I committed these acts." End quote. I call bullshit. I think he's only sorry that he got caught because he could have, at any given time, turned himself in or just stopped. But he didn't. He is so full of shit. This brings us to the evening of Friday, January 2nd, 1981. This being only about 46 days after he had brutally killed Jacqueline Hill. Peter had left his home in Bradford shortly after 4 p.m., telling his wife that he was headed out to grab keys of his sister's car, which he had said had broken down again. Of course, Peter didn't head in the direction that he would have, which was Bingley. He drove instead to the scrapyard that was located near Mirfield. Sorry if I butchered that. And this was just outside of Leeds. While he was in the scrapyard, he grabbed 2 license plates from a vehicle called a Skoda, or Skoda? I'm going to say Skoda. One plate was already fallen off, and Peter yanked the other off. Around 9 p.m. that evening, he called his wife Sonia from a gas station and let her know that he was supposedly having car troubles. He then put the stolen plates onto his vehicle, which at the time was a Rover. He then cruised around what was called the Havelock Square District, which of course was a red light district in Sheffield, and this was around 30 minutes away from his house. At the time, there was a young sex worker, 19 years old, named Denise Hall, who was walking on the street when she saw a potential customer who was driving a brown Rover 500. Of course, this was Peter. He pulled up to the curb. He then asked Denise if she was quote-unquote doing business. Denise noticed this man had a beard that was said to be neatly trimmed, black in color, and also had dark wavy hair. She recalled that she bent down so she could talk to Peter, and that his eyes were, quote, dark, almost black, and appeared to pierce through her own. I guess his eyes frightened her so badly that when she saw them, she said sorry and walked off. Holy crap, can you imagine finding out later that you almost got into the Yorkshire Ripper's car? Yikes. Another sex worker, a young woman aged 24 named Olivia Reavers, was said to have been a sex worker for 4 years at the time, and she was walking down a street called Broom Hall when she too spotted the Rover. She said the driver asked if she was doing business, and she told him that she was, and that it would be £10 in the car with a condom. Peter informed her that that was okay with him and she got in. Peter drove Olivia the half-mile distance to Melbourne Avenue and ended up parking in a driveway of what was called the Light Trades House. I spent a long time trying to figure out what this was because I was confused by the fact that this building, as they called it, had a driveway and not a parking lot, and I was having a hard time figuring out what the company was. After some digging, correct me if I'm wrong, UK listeners, but I believe a trading house is a company or business that are basically the in-between guys for international commercial selling or buying. They work on the exporting and importing of goods between countries. As they pulled into the driveway and shut the lights off of the vehicle, Olivia asked Peter if he would like to pay first, which he then did. She then proceeded to grab a condom, and this is when Peter would ask her, quote, "Do you mind if I talk to you a bit?" When Olivia said she didn't mind, he then told her all about an argument that he had had with his wife, and then asked her what her name was. Olivia told him that her name was Sharon, and Peter told her that his name was Dave. When the Ripper removed his coat and placed it in the back seat, he then asked Olivia if she would like to get into the back, to which she replied, quote, "No, it's all right." After the pair removed the necessary clothing to engage in sexual activities, after about 10 minutes of trying to have sex, Peter was still unable to get an erection. This is when Olivia said she didn't think that they would be able to have sex, and Peter replied with, he guessed not. As the pair returned to talking about what they had been talking about earlier, all of a sudden, headlights hit both of them inside the car as another car drove up the driveway and stopped right in front of Peter's car. Sergeant Robert Ring, who was said to be a 26-year-old that was working with the South Yorkshire Police, but was also a veteran, got out of the vehicle. In tow was a newly hired probationary constable by the name of Robert Hydes. The two officers had just started their shift about 10 p.m., and as they were patrolling Melbourne Avenue, they spotted the Rover parked halfway up the driveway of the Light Trades house, and they pretty much knew why the car was parked there. When the new constable, Robert Hydes, came up to the car, Peter said to Olivia, quote, "Leave it to me, you're my girlfriend." This is when the Ripper would roll down his window and told the policeman that his name was Peter Williams. While Peter was talking to PC Robert Hydes, Sergeant Robert Ring was actually in the back of Peter's vehicle and was taking a look at the license plates. He headed back to his own patrol car and radioed in to check on the license plate numbers. When PC Hyde also returned to the vehicle, he was apparently open about his skepticism with Peter's information that he gave him. It was during this time that the two officers were waiting to hear back about the plates that Peter asked Olivia if she could just make a run for it, to which she replied no, because at the time she was a well-known sex worker. When the officers got the information back from headquarters that the plates were actually for a Skoda vehicle, the officers returned to Peter's car. Later, Sergeant Ring said during the trial, from his report, that Peter had said Olivia was his girlfriend, and when the officer asked Peter what her name was, he replied with, quote, "I don't know, I haven't known her that long." Dude, really? What a moron. The officer said something about, "Who are you trying to kid?" to Peter. He then told Peter that the license plates were not for his vehicle, and he took the keys out of Peter's ignition. The two officers then escorted Olivia back to their patrol car, which would prove to be a mistake, as they left Peter sitting in his own car, alone. While Peter sat there alone, he realized what this situation was turning out to be, and he used the opportunity. He grabbed his ball-peen hammer and the knife that he had under his car seat and then headed towards the building that they were next to, behind his car. Without any permission of being able to leave his vehicle, he told the policeman that he was, quote, "busting for a pee." The officers believed him, and Peter slipped out of view. Next to the porch was an oil storage tank that was used for the building, and Peter put both weapons on the ground on top of some leaves and had hoped the officers didn't hear the clinking sound they made as he went back to his vehicle. Peter was then taken with Olivia to the Hamilton Road police station. When he got there, Peter asked if he could again use the bathroom. He had concealed a knife in his jacket. When he got into the bathroom, he removed it through a hole in his jacket, and he placed it into the toilet tank so no one would find the weapon on him. I cannot believe that the officers didn't pat him down before they put him into their vehicle. In Peter's coat was still a piece of rope, apparently the same rope that he had used to strangle Marguerite and tried to use to strangle Dr. Bandera. At the station, Peter admitted his real name and where he lived, and also admitted to having stolen the license plates. He used the excuse of stealing and using the plates because in a little less than 2 weeks, he said he had a court date for a drunk driving charge. He said his insurance had ran out, and since he figured that he was going to lose his license anyways, he didn't think it was worth renewing. If Peter was charged with the theft of those license plates, then he would need to be handed off to the jurisdiction of where those plates were taken. While he was in his cell, he fell asleep and figured he would get out of the situation if he wanted to. He thought that he would just convince the authorities that it was just a theft. He claimed that as he was sitting there, he was still, quote, being fed instructions on how to go on with my mission, although I had been prevented from killing that girl in the car, end quote. The authorities established that Peter would be moved, and the Dewsbury police said to the Sheffield police that at the new shift change at 6 a.m., someone would be there to collect Peter Sutcliffe. When the West Yorkshire police officers got Peter, one of them drove his Rover back as well. It said that normally any charge of theft of any property that was less than 50 pounds would normally just be resulted in an immediate remand on bail, basically meaning that they would just be let go and just needed to show up for their trial for their charge. However, because the police work that was done on the Jacqueline Hill murder when the authorities just did that short search and failed to find her body or other items of the attack, now there was an order from the Chief Constable Ronald Gregory that if there was any man found with a sex worker in any suspicious circumstances, then they needed to be brought into the Ripper squad. At this point, the Dewsbury sergeant called the Ripper incident room, said to be at Millgarth at 8 a.m. that morning, Saturday, January 3rd, to let him know that Peter Sutcliffe would be arriving. After he is searched, he was taken to the basement for an interview. Not shaken in the least, Peter tells the authorities that he's a lorry driver, aka a truck driver, from the Bradford area. He talks about where he usually delivers, talks about his interest in cars, and then said he was actually interviewed as part of the 5-pound note search from the Jean Jordan case, and finally tells them he was also interviewed for being flagged in the red light district areas. At this time, the Dewsbury police placed a second call around 10 a.m., letting the Ripper incident room know that they may want to interview Peter Sutcliffe. The officers that were interviewing Peter in the basement made note of his dark hair, the gap between his front teeth like the bite marks, and the shoe size that was consistent with the numerous shoe prints that were found at particularly 3 of the murder scenes. Right around this time, Sonia was called to be notified that her husband was in custody of the authorities and was being questioned about theft of license plates. Detective Sergeant Desmond O'Boyle arrived to the Dewsbury police station around noon that same day, as he was a part of the Ripper squad. He had already seen the files on Peter Sutcliffe, and the files showed that Peter was already known to the Ripper squad and was also seen numerous times by the authorities during the investigation into the Ripper. After the DS was asking Peter questions about more pleasant things like his interests and social and home life, his employment record, and other things that could be useful, then he was questioned about his arrest, and Peter told the story of the junkyard, the license plate, and not renewing his insurance. The DS then started asking Peter about his sex life with his wife. He asked Peter if his sex life with his wife was normal, to which Peter said it was normal, as they had just had sex 4 days earlier. He was then further interviewed and questioned about sex because Peter had stated that he and Sonia, his wife, were constantly rowing, but always forgot about the rows when they went to bed. So I had to look up what rows or rowing was, and it's just their way of saying arguing. I got the feeling that during the beginning of this interview, Peter was able to keep his cool, but one of the times that Peter got shifty and seemed concerned for himself was when the DS O'Boyle had asked Peter for his blood sample. At one time, Peter asked, quote, "What if it's the same as the one you're wanting?" Then DS O'Boyle flat out asked Peter if he was the Ripper, and of course, he said he wasn't. When the DS then asked him why he would need to worry about it then, Peter caved and said fine, he would give it up, and asked if he could be let known as soon as the results came back. So I'm assuming here with the time frame and knowing a little of what they did and didn't have back then at their disposal in ways of DNA, I'm assuming that they were just trying to get a blood type to see if it matched the Ripper at this time. It was said that Peter was then found to belong to a rare B group of blood types. By the early evening of around 5:30, DS O'Boyle didn't think that Peter was the Ripper and figured this would just be a false alarm. In fact, he was actually ready to recommend that they release Peter, but the chief superintendent at the time, John Clark, was not so sure and still thought that Peter was a major suspect to be the Yorkshire Ripper. Detective inspector that was also on the case by the name of John Boyle then took over in the murder room around 6 p.m. that evening and also agreed that Peter was still a good suspect. This is when he told DS O'Boyle that there was still a lot more they could find out about Peter. So, when DS O'Boyle continued his interview, he pressed hard on Peter. He then spouted a story about 3 young men needing a ride, and surprisingly, they gave him a 10-pound note for the ride. And then he told the part about the license plates. Then he said that he was driving and a woman flagged him down, and because he allegedly thought that she was in trouble, he stopped to pick her up. He pretended to be surprised that she was a sex worker when she asked him if he wanted business. He then said that he was thinking about things, and because he had this 10-pound note, quote, burning a hole in my pocket, and I thought I might as well use it. He then said the first girl left, so he drove on to find another one and stopped. He then said he paid Olivia, but that he just wanted to talk, that he did not want sex at all. When Peter was questioned about all of the times his vehicle was flagged for being in the red light districts of Bradford, Leeds, and the Manchester area, he had previously denied ever being in Manchester, so he gave some stupid story about his car having broke down and that he left it in a parking lot in Bradford city center. He then said, well, someone must have taken the car, gone to Manchester, and then put it back in the exact same spot. What a moron. Okay, Peter. When asked for his alibi on the evening that Jacqueline Hill was killed, Peter said that he was at home with his wife. When D.S. O'Boyle said that his wife would be interviewed as well, Peter begged him not to tell Sonia that he had been arrested while with a sex worker. D.S. O'Boyle said he got himself into this situation. His car was flagged so many times in the red light district areas, and the fact that he was arrested with a sex worker, he didn't believe any of these were coincidences and said as much. He told Peter he believed that he was a regular punter. So I looked it up, and a punter is what we would call like a John, or what they used to call a trick. Peter claimed that he had never been with any sex worker. Peter was described during these interviews as calm and very pleasant, as well as cooperative. Around 10 p.m. that evening, Peter was locked into his cell as the interviews were done for the evening. Around that same time this evening, when Sergeant Robert Ring, back at the Hamerton Road Police, who, if you remember, was one of the arresting officers of Peter, had learned that Peter was still in custody and was still being interviewed by the Ripper police as a potential suspect, he would do something that would blow this case wide open. Sergeant Ring remembered back to how Peter had left his vehicle to supposedly pee next to the building and decided to go have himself a look in the area that Peter had gone. When he was shining his flashlight around the area of the oil storage tank, he saw on the ground beside the wall there was lying a ball-peen hammer and a knife. Yes! Good for Sergeant Robert Ring. Woo! By 11:05 that night, the Hamerton Road Police were on the phone informing the Ripper incident room of what they had found. They were told to leave them there, where they lied, until a photograph could be taken of the weapons. D.I. John Boyle, if you remember, who believed Peter was still a good suspect and ordered D.S. O'Boyle to continue interviewing Peter, immediately set down the phone and got into his car and headed for Sheffield. When he arrived, he ordered a more thorough search of the area and a re-interview of Olivia Reivers. At midnight that evening, John Boyle called Drewsbury and let them know the information, and right after this, he called the superintendent Richard Holland, who was in charge of the overall Ripper squad that weekend, and said, quote, I think we've got him. I just have to say, as I'm learning this right alongside of you, I am so freaking excited right now. The next morning at 9:30, Peter's house was searched and Sonia was taken in for questioning. They found at his residence numerous tools to bring in, including a hacksaw, ball-peen hammers, and a yellow-handled screwdriver. They had also found in Peter's Rover 3 screwdrivers that had been inside the glove compartment. What a moron to be driving around with so many screwdrivers, hammers, and knives as he was. Duh. Sonia was able to provide a few alibis for her husband, and when she was shown the knife that was found by the hammer next to the Light Trades building, she was able to identify the knife as one that she had bought before she had gotten married for her quote-unquote bottom drawer. When I looked up what that meant, the description I found was that this concept was British, and it means a chest or a box that a young lady keeps her things in that she will use after she gets married, like a hope chest. Things like silverware and linen are often kept in these chests. I didn't know that this was a thing, and for the time period and the old-timey of it all, I thought that this was adorable that little girls or young women did this back then. They ended up interviewing Sonia until 8 p.m. that evening with a small break in the afternoon. Poor woman. When Peter arose this next day at 8 a.m., he ate and drank coffee, and then he was taken into an interview room for another day of interviews. This time, however, not only was D.I. John Boyle going to interview him, but so was D.S. Peter Smith. Smith was armed with detailed knowledge of the facts of each attack and the backgrounds as well. It was said that he was part of the Ripper squad almost longer than anyone else had been a part of it. The authorities knew that D.S. Smith would be a key element in the interviews. On this morning, the interviews went not alarmingly at first, as the pair tried to systematically shut down any loose ends that Peter could escape to during the more intense interviewing. And again, Peter at the time was calm, cooperative, friendly, and articulate. After lunch, the officers started questioning Peter specifically about his whereabouts on specific dates that the Yorkshire Ripper had attacked on. Peter was specifically interviewed about a night in question that was referred to as Bonfire Night, and this was the night that Teresa Sykes was attacked. Peter was clocked out of work around 5 p.m. that evening and then said he stopped for a drink, and then over and over again said that he was home by 8 p.m. When the officers asked how he knew it was 8 p.m., Peter started saying that if it were any later, he would have been able to see the bonfires. Little did Peter know that this would actually be the first alibi that his wife Sonia and his story would not match up. Okay, now to the juicy part. As John Boyle was interviewing Peter, he was pressing Peter that he did not believe his story about giving the supposed 3 men a ride and putting on the license plates because of the insurance, and then just deciding to get a sex worker that evening. John Boyle told Peter he believed that he went out that night with the sole purpose of finding a sex worker, which Peter kept denying. Finally, when John Boyle brought up and asked Peter if he remembered leaving his car the night that he was arrested and going by the building that night, Peter said yes, he went to urinate against the wall of the building. Boyle then said, quote, "I think you went there for another purpose." Peter didn't respond to this, but later on would say, quote, "I realized that this was the time to tell them, because they were saying in other words that they had found the weapons I had hidden. I have been given the signal from God through the police that now was the time to tell them," end quote. According to the website execulink.com, which, by the way, I have to give a huge shout out to because so much of my research came from them and they're piecing together so much of the Yorkshire Ripper stories, the following was said between Peter and John Boyle. Remember, Boyle had just told Peter that he went next to the building for another reason, not to pee. Boyle: "Do you understand what I'm saying? I think you're in trouble. Serious trouble." Peter: "I think you have been leading up to it." Boyle: "Leading up to what?" Peter: "The Yorkshire Ripper." Boyle: "What about the Yorkshire Ripper?" Peter: "Well, it's me." Holy shit, right? Just like that, at the mere inclination that they may have found weapons, Peter decided to just lay it all out right there on the table. I feel like if I had been in that room, my jaw would have quite literally hit the damn floor. Oh my God. Boyle had to stop Peter and let him know that he was not obligated to say anything unless he wanted to, but to know that whatever he said could be put in writing and used as evidence. Peter said he understood. When Boyle said that he could have a lawyer present, Peter said he didn't need one. He said he just wanted to tell them everything that he had done and he was glad that this would be over. He then said that he would have killed Olivia if they wouldn't have stopped him, but that he did want to tell his wife Sonia himself. He said he didn't want her to have to hear it from anyone else. I wonder what that conversation was like. Can you imagine? Oh my God. Peter then started his confessions of everything that he had and hadn't done. A few things that I had left out of these installments were some letters and tapes that had been sent to the police that were actually not from Peter, but someone else claiming to be him. And if you're interested in this information, as well as other victims that were not part of the Yorkshire Ripper, that were thought to be at first, you can head to the websites that I will link in the transcripts. Peter started his confessions with saying that it all started out with Wilma McCann. He wasn't going to kill her at first, but since she was mocking him, he grew into a beast. Peter then recanted his attacks on all of the women in a calm, chilling, and quite unemotional way. It took Peter 15 hours and 45 minutes to tell his entire statement. This first confession didn't include all of the attacks that Peter would later be charged with. During Peter's 2-week-long trial, he had pled not guilty despite his confessions, but did plead guilty to manslaughter and tried to use the grounds of diminished responsibility. Of course, he tried to use this whole mission from God thing that we know that he used in some confessions. However, it was stated that that was not at first said in any capacity when he first confessed. So I'm not going to go over the entire trial gavel to gavel because it would be a whole other part. So I'm just going to give the highlights as we wrap up this 4-part Yorkshire Ripper case. Peter had basically convinced the prosecution and some doctors that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, with him saying over and over that he was hearing voices telling him to kill and that this entire thing was God's will. The prosecution was going to accept his not guilty plea to murder because of the diminished responsibility, so he almost got out of having to have a trial. Holy shit. Thankfully, the judge didn't agree and said that the medics involved in his alleged diagnosis had only formed their opinions based on what Peter Sutcliffe had told them, and that this, of course, was different from what he had told the police when he was arrested and interviewed. The judge said this would be a matter for the jury to decide, and the Attorney General needed to prove the case that Peter Sutcliffe knew exactly what he was doing when he brutally attacked and then mutilated his victims. In my opinion, I agree. Just reading so much of his confessions during the research of this case, and of course I only put in like one line from each confession after each victim because I didn't want to overload it with his confessions, but I agree that he knew exactly what he was doing. I don't believe for 1 second that he heard the voices telling him to kill sex workers. During Peter's trial, it was pointed out by a man named Sir Michael, and these words would end up being infamous about this case, stating, quote, "Some were prostitutes, but perhaps the saddest part of these cases is that some were not. The last 6 attacks were on totally respectable women," end quote. Needless to say, these comments actually sparked protests outside of the courts. His words were gross and completely inappropriate in my own opinion. The saddest part of this case should have been pointed out that Peter was able to do the things that he did to these women for 5 years without being caught, and that each and every victim, regardless of their job, was mutilated in ways that only a sick, twisted fuck like Peter could accomplish. He actually had admitted in some cases that he knew they weren't sex workers, so his whole God's mission is bullshit. After the trial lasting 15 days, the jury was out for 6 hours, reaching their verdicts. They, of course, found him guilty of the 13 murder charges, and whilst the judge read the verdict, he added on, quote, "If I may say so, murder of a very cowardly quality." Then the judge spoke to the fact that he was without words to the brutality and the gravity of his murders, and said basically the crimes could speak for themselves. The judge then sentenced Peter Sutcliffe to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years, and said out loud that he hoped Peter would never be released. I was shocked. A minimum of 30 years? That's nuts. I would have thought for sure that it would be life without parole or the death sentence or something like that. Holy shit. Apparently in 1984, Peter was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, which is a high-security psychiatric hospital in Berkshire, England, on the basis that he was suffering a severe mental disorder. Basically, on appeal, the diminished capacity could be used if he was suffering to the point that he shouldn't be held accountable for his actions. Again, Peter not having said anything during his confessions or during his arrest was a problem for him trying to claim this. So, this sentence means that he could never have the possibility of being free until 2011. But it was stated that in 2010, the High Court actually issued to Peter Sutcliffe a whole life tariff, which means he would never get released. Thank God. When the person representing Peter during his appeal of the whole life tariff sentence was asked if Peter could be faking his mental illness, he could only really say to look at the longevity of 30 years. And because it had been so long, they didn't think he was faking it. Which is nuts to me because that's not really an answer. I call bullshit, but that's just my opinion. I think Peter Sutcliffe was a monster, knowing exactly what he was doing, getting sexual enjoyment out of it, and the whole voices thing was complete bullshit. Either he came up with it or it was put in his head as a possible way to mitigate his charges. The timeline was all too convenient, and if he was fighting with appeals even past 2011, then why wouldn't he continue to fake the voices, still hoping that it would get him out? It makes complete sense. I don't think it would be that hard to tell a psychiatrist that you hear voices, and at some point along the way, it was just a given that he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and probably barely questioned. I have never read another case in which the man's own attorney was asked if his client could be faking his mental illness, probably because Peter was missing some of the hallmark symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, and this is according to the mentalhealthamerica.org, and we already know this, but the most common symptoms are delusions, hallucinations, disordered speech, or thinking. They usually also present with emotional flatness, lack of initiative, and social withdrawal. We know Peter quite enjoyed going out with drinks and friends, held down a job, and I never once read anything about Peter talking to himself or having any signs of delusions or hallucinations. I am just calling all around bullshit. Again, just my opinion. Peter Sutcliffe ended up dying from COVID on October 28th, 2020. Holy crap, right? I had no idea that he lived that long. He was said to have suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, diabetes, angina, and almost blinded by an attack from a fellow inmate. Good. I hope he fucking suffered. He was a piece of shit right until the end, and I'll tell you why. Apparently, he had boasted that he would never get COVID, and when prisoners did contract the illness, they were given the option to isolate and be confined to their cells to shield the other prisoners, which, of course, Peter did not take that option. And that, my friends, is the end of the Yorkshire Ripper series of Peter Sutcliffe, rapist, brutal killer, body mutilator, sadist, and all-around piece of shit. First off, what a fucking case, right? It was interesting, to say the least, of just the sheer brutality that this man was capable of, right? I was just left with awe that this was real. Secondly, I'm glad he died. And I think it's funny that he died of COVID after boasting that he would never get sick with it. If karma is a real thing, I hope he was miserable in prison, and I hope he got fucked with all the time. Being nearly blinded, at least we know he was once. He was just a sickening human being that the world is a better place without. I hope nothing but happiness and peace for his surviving victims, the families of the victims taken from this world way before their time, and for anyone, including his own wife, who was affected by this monster. I am so glad to be getting out of the headspace of this man's world. The final count of script for this case was 52.5 pages. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this asshat as much as I did. I hope you guys will come on back next week as we dive into another case here on The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on The Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.